All right. Well, good morning, Rotary District 7770, and welcome to Conversations with Rotary Action People for Friday, July the 17th. My name is Donald Hovis from the CWRAP Rotary Club here in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina, and we are pleased to be joined today by the 16th President of the United States of America, Mr. Abraham Lincoln. Good morning, sir.
Morning, friends. Good to be with you.
And for those interested in where our president is joining us from, he is coming to us from the Midwestern White House here, which is in Freeport, Illinois. So thanks for being with us, and thanks for carving out some time to join the wonderful folks here of District 7770 this morning.
My pleasure.
Well, to kick us off, I'm going to do the vision statement of Rotary. Together, we see a world where people unite and take action to create lasting change across the globe, in our communities, and in ourselves. I would like to introduce to you the Conversations with Rotary Action People team. Our public image chair from the Rotary Club of 5 Points in Columbia, Miss Mary Gass. Good morning, Mary. And our district communications officer from the Somerville Evening Rotary Club in Somerville, South Carolina, Mr. Terry Moore. Thank you. Now, if you're joining us here, thank you very much for joining us. Please go to the chat box and tell us your name, obviously, your Rotary Club, and where you're watching from today. And then we're also streaming this over on the Rotary International District 7770 Facebook page. Please go over, if you're on there, thank you for watching. Please post a comment below the stream on where you're watching from and your Rotary Club as well. And if you have any questions for our president, please post those in the chat box or comment below the stream, and we'll get to those here towards the end of the day's segment. So, Mr. President, I was looking up, you and your history earlier today, and I'm a big quote person. So I want to start off, obviously, with one of the quotes that you've said that I think is really, really, it's motivational. I'm a big motivational quote kind of person. So it says, folks are usually about as happy as they make their minds up to be.
And you just summed up the entire political discourse in America in your time. And of course, I relate to it at a very, very personal level, having been the head of an administration during a divided country. So generally speaking, you're going to be in the situation you're in, and how you react to it is going to be up to you. But I always said that an enemy was a friend I hadn't made yet. So I never discounted anybody on a political opinion or otherwise, because once you sit down and figure out where you can agree, you can pretty much move forward. But that's providing both sides of the argument are talking. If you can't get them to talk yet, then you got to work on that by another means. But generally speaking, we're all going to be as happy as we decide we are, and move forward the best we can. A good quote, though, Donald, and a good way to start the meeting.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I do want to call you guys to the chat box because I think this is worth noting. We have a gentleman on the line who's filled out a membership application, not yet inducted, and is already part of a CWRAP. Mr. John Wright, thank you for being here, sir.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
And good luck there in Lexington, South Carolina. Wish you all the best.
We'll give John a huzzah this morning. Huzzah.
All right. So, Mr. President, I think I want to start this interview out today with, we know today, most of us at least know today, how the process is to become a president of the United States. I think most of us do know that. Let's go way, way back in time, though. Can you tell us about the process it took for you to become the President of the United States?
An insightful question. And again, the parallels. And for this time, brief time we're together, I know your history and you know my history, and we can have this conversation, which is in our imagination. So now it's as real as it gets. But in my day, the political word was that the office sought the man, not the man seeking the office. So you had operatives that would speak on your behalf. And in fact, in my day, the candidates didn't even go to the convention. You stayed home. And if somebody wanted a speech, they'd come to your place. And maybe there'd be a gathering there in the front, and they'd call you out on the porch. And they'd say, speech, speech. And you'd give a speech from your front porch, and then you'd thank them, and you'd go back in and be quiet. So it was actually out of Bloomington, Illinois, my good friends, David Davis, Leonard Sweat, and Jesse Fell. They went to the convention in Chicago. They said, we think this fellow Lincoln's got something in what he's been saying in his speeches. So then, but once the nomination was secured on the third ballot, now we had edged out William Seward, the senator from New York. He was the odds-on favorite, but he was so strongly abolitionist that the party knew an abolitionist couldn't get elected. They was looking for somebody moderate. So here's Davis, Sweat, and Fell running around Chicago to the various delegations, and they knew that Seward was the favorite, so they say to the delegates, if your man Seward can't get the nomination, who's your second choice? And they go to Missouri. They'd say, well, we know you're for Bates. What if Bates can't get the nomination? Who's your second choice? And Pennsylvania, and on and on and on. So when it was deadlocked, going into the third ballot, old Norman Judd from Chicago, he was a journalist. He jumped up there in the convention hall and he said, I nominate Abraham Lincoln. And everybody thought, well, that's our second choice. So they all acquiesced in. And then I became the nominee. But in those days, you would meet individually with editors, and they'd ask you some questions, and they'd print the answers. No press conferences to speak. In fact, there's more folks on this screen than I ever had in any kind of interrogatories. But that's how you got the job done. You had to have a cadre of folks who believed you could do the job, and then they went out and got the job done for you. But can you imagine a candidate not going to the convention and not giving any speeches during the whole campaign? It's a novel approach. Maybe its time has come again.
And if I'm correct, you're the first Republican president elected in the United States?
Yes, sir. John C. Fremont got the nomination in '56, but he was a little more radical than the party and the country was ready for. But Stephen Douglas himself said there would be a Republican elected in '60, even though he wanted it and was going to run as a Democrat. He knew the time was come.
And now looking over the timeline of your history of being president, looks like you were inducted on March the 4th of 1861. On April 12th of 1861, I think you know what happened.
Yep.
That happens to be in our district here in South Carolina. Those of you wondering what that is, that's Fort Sumter. Okay? It's the battle at Fort Sumter. I want you to talk about the battle at Fort Sumter on April 12th.
Well, right there in Charleston Harbor, we had the fort. And of course, I'd mentioned to you that when I had signed on in the militia down in Dixon, Illinois, Fort Whiteside, the fellow that swore me in was Major Anderson. And later on, he would be the commander at Fort Sumter. when the flag was taken down. So I had known him for some 30 years, not well. But there sits the flag. Now, here's the great conundrum. As your president, I take the oath of office to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution, so help me God. And when the founding fathers put those documents together, they were what we call in the law in perpetuity. Once signed, they don't end. So here's the great conundrum. What do I do as president with a set of states who say they want to secede, but secession isn't called for in the Constitution? Yet as the chief administrator, I have sworn an oath in heaven to preserve, protect, and defend it. Now, the fellas in the cabinet, they say, well, you just send warships down there and you tell them. And in the great nullification crisis back in the 30s over the tariffs, our fellow South Carolinians said, well, we want to secede. And Jackson then, who was president, said, well, try it. And by God, I'll send the army to South Carolina. I'll arrest the governor and the legislature, and the United States government will run South Carolina. And Jackson must have had some oomph behind him, because the folks said, well, we'll settle down. And I think Senator Calhoun had something to do with the healing balm on that. But now with me as president-elect, I had no powers. And so that secession movement moved forward till I could take the oath of office on March the 4th. But there's one of our fellow Americans, Edmund Ruffin, who was so agitated looking out into Charleston Harbor, seeing that flag fly, that his emotions overtook him and he lit the fuse on one of the artillery pieces and fired that volley out onto the fort in Charleston Harbor. I was a notion that if I sent military support to the fort, that it would look like I was drawing them out to war. So the ship that I sent only had food and provisions for health and welfare. But that ship was fired on and returned back and said, well, we can't get them the supplies they need just to survive. There was nothing military on that boat, and that was by design. But once the artillery had been fired, now I'm called upon as commander-in-chief to quell this secession. And in fact, I had met with Stephen Douglas prior to the inauguration. I said, I'm thinking about calling 75,000 troops. And Stephen Douglas himself, a friend of South Carolina, said, sir, you're going to need 250,000 troops. And he took umbrage with my word of the use, quelling the secession. And he'd written a couple of letters and had given a speech called Save the Flag. And he said, there is this upcoming, and he referred to it as a war before it was official. He said, this war will be calamitous. And he doubted, in one of the letters that I read, he said he doubted we would ever recover from the war. So the prophecy, if you will, of Stephen Douglas did bear the fruit that he predicted.
Thank you for that. Now I want to kind of take what you talked about with Fort Sumter, and really, you know, much of your presidency, there was a lot of war. There was a lot of violence. Why do you think that was? And what did you do to, you know, to do your best to help all of those efforts?
Well, I had called for, and I'd referenced my first inaugural, where I said we must not be enemies, but friends. And that I called on the better angels of our nature to take hold of us. But I never considered, in fact, in that whole period of time, that 4 years of war, my entire first term was consumed by the war. But I had said early on that if the sides that were agitated would merely stop the discussion of secession, come back to Washington, and have that discussion about what we needed to do to patch things up politically. But the threads had been so strained that folks were at their wits' end. And it had become so extreme in the country, starting in '56 with John Brown. You all learned it as Bleeding Kansas, the war before the war. And John Brown himself said, "We will purge this land with blood." That's in 1856, a couple years after Kansas, Nebraska, which Douglas was of a notion, let the people decide. I mean, you talk about, our Republican democracy, we elect representatives, but it's the people's will. And Douglas thought, well, let the people decide, which gave us a little time, but certainly not enough. But even during the war, folks said, well, what are you going to do? And I said, all the governments have to do is take the oath of allegiance to the United States and return their elected officials to Washington, and we'll continue with the business at hand. And so, but as time, the strain of time wore on, each side had dug in their heels more and more. And then here comes the criticism of the chief executive. I'm trying to hold the abolitionists at the table who wanted immediate emancipation. And I have the war Democrats who said, well, we're just going to go to war till this is done. We're going to beat them. So I'm holding their hand, trying to keep them at the table. Then there's this group of radicals in the Republican Party. And they don't like how the war is being handled, so they put a government committee. And while I'm saying that, I'm reminded of the verse that was never printed in the Bible. For God so loved the world, he didn't send a committee. And that's the first thing we do in government is form a committee. Well, that's what they did. A committee on the conduct of the war. Put out volumes of work because they didn't like the way I was handling it. So they wanted it investigated. And so that was going on. I'm trying to keep them at the table. So it was like herding cats. And of course, then I had Clement Vallandigham out of Ohio giving agitation speeches in the Congress. So he was finally expelled. And I had to shoot soldiers for running away. They were ordered to be shot, but I couldn't touch a wily hair on the head of the agitator, making them run away in the first place. And so suspension of the writ of habeas corpus. It was not wholesale. I shut down some of the presses. I didn't shut down. They said, well, he's a dictator. He's a tyrant. Dictators and tyrants deal universally. I was selective in the newspapers that were shut down. And the writ, we didn't hold people in perpetuity in jail, only those that were agitating the public mind on the war. And so it was just Donald, it was just a mess. And then what do we look like on the world stage? Here's this great experiment in democracy that Jefferson called it. And folks thought it was ready to fail after 80 some years. But I wasn't ready to let it go. Oh, appreciate that, Terry Moore. It helps if you got folks that are willing to talk. If they're not willing to talk, then you're not having a very meaningful conversation.
Talk to us a little bit about the Gettysburg Address.
And I appreciate that, Donald. That's You know, I considered that speech a flat failure. And of course, I was asked to be the second speaker. Edward Everett of Harvard University was to deliver the 2-hour address. And anytime you was asked to speak in my day, you was expected to talk 2 hours, except for Rotary International District 7770. I'm only going to do a half hour. And so I prepared my remarks at the old soldiers' home. You all call it Walter Reed now, Anderson Cottage. And I showed it to Seward. I said, what do you think? And Seward says, well, Mr. President, it's a good start. He even thought I should go 2 hours. But I was told to deliver a few appropriate remarks. They didn't want me there. They were angry at the carnage. We had not the money or the manpower to bury and care for 50-some thousand dead and wounded, and let alone 10,000 pack animals. I saw a letter from a farmer written at the time, and he said, you can smell the stench in Gettysburg and not even go there. So that's what we were dealing with. So they petitioned, the borough of Gettysburg petitioned the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, their delegation, and the governor for a federal cemetery. And so they said, David Wills had sent me the invitations to deliver a few appropriate remarks. So I knew I had to get there, say something, and sit down. So that was my thinking. But the end of the war was not seen. So I couldn't address a victorious people. I couldn't address a defeated people. But I had to answer the great question, what is to come of the war, and not just for the people of our country, but the people of the world. Hence the line, the world will little note nor long remember what we say here, but it will never forget what they did here. It is for us, the living, to be dedicated here to the great task remaining before us. And at one other point, I talked about our democracy being the last best hope of earth. And so to talk to the people of the world as what it means. And I think the great Virginian, Thomas Jefferson, said, and I'm loath to say this in a public audience, and they don't always get the quote right, but Jefferson said, from time to time, the tree of liberty must be quenched with the blood of patriots or tyrants. Now contemplate that in a very serious thought. And you'll hear that quote said that from time to time, the tree of liberty must be quenched with the blood of the patriots. The full quote says, and tyrants. So I'll leave that what it is. But we certainly survived. And I, along with, in 1863, prior to that, I issued the Emancipation Proclamation as a war measure to keep Britain and France out of the war on the side of the Confederacy. They had sent diplomats to the Confederacy saying, we'll come in, and when you win, we'll carve up the North, give half of it to France and half of it to England. So I had to march on freedom to keep them on the world stage and look like hypocrites if they came in siding with the Confederacy, which by the blockade and the emancipation, we were able to keep France and Britain out of the war. So those are the two great events of 63, the emancipation in January and the address at Gettysburg in November, although I thought it was going to be a flat failure. Edward Everett told me afterwards, he said he wished he could have done in 2 hours what I did in 2 minutes. And would I send him a copy? And so the copy that I read every year at Gettysburg in November is the copy that I sent to Edward Everett. And that's the one that was published in the papers. So, well, And I don't know if you can see the telegraphs coming in here. It's much easier than when in the days at the War Department, they'd be tapped in and I'd have to have somebody decipher them. They come in right now. So here's Terry, Carolina Forest Rotary. And I knew Terry's a good boy. Those of you that know Terry, I want to speak on his behalf. He's an upstanding young man. I've known him and the family for decades. I can say that too now, can't I, Terry? Decades. So the negotiation in politics, what we've got is the parties have carved up the number of seats in the Congress, and they'll say, well, this is a GOP district or this is a Democratic district. And so they're willing to let those lines lay as opposed to carve out a district that allows for the middle. So when you look at the seats in Congress, they're either red or blue. And then you'll hear occasionally there's 4 or 5 swing districts in the Congress. Well, you can't get commitment to negotiate if you have no middle. And so you all are seeing the extremes in the Congress that I saw back in the mid-50s and at the beginning of the war. Very, very divided. Very few folks in the middle, or what we refer to as the moderates. You know, I had the radical Republicans, I had the Copperheads, I had the abolitionists. Where was the middle? Even in Illinois, our governors are struggling with the legislature because we reduced the number of the legislators. Well, when we reduced the number, we took out the middle. So there's nobody to talk between the sides and say, here's what's good for everybody. We've lost that discussion. And then I'll finish up in that discussion in the debates with Stephen Douglas, my friend for 30 years, that Freeport Doctrine, and I'm sitting right here in the county where that debate took place. And I was told, if you ask the question about popular sovereignty, Douglas is going to whomp you. And I said, well, he may want me, but if he answers my question, his future in the Democratic Party is done. So I asked him here in Freeport, question number 2. I said, can the people, now listen carefully to how this is worded. This is worded by a lawyer. Can the people of a United States territory in any lawful way against the wish of any citizen of the United States exclude slavery from their limits prior to the formation of a state constitution? Now, what you just said was folks have the right to determine what their constitution's going to be before it's written. The rights of the people secede the rights, and prior to that, the Senate approved all those constitutions. Now Douglas opens the door by answering the Freeport question with his doctrine that the people of territories can, by lawful means, exclude slavery from their limits. And that killed his future with any support in the South. All his friends, all those years in the South, rejected Stephen Douglas. So when he ran for president in 1860, Southern Democrats bolted from the convention. That was up in Baltimore. They said, we're out of here. And they reconvened in Charleston. The Southern Democrats, then nominating Vice President John C. Breckinridge from Kentucky. The split in the Democrat Party took me to the office of president. But that split started, as Terry said, can you address the importance of the Freeport Doctrine? That little square down here, downtown Freeport, called Debate Square. The theme of that square is the road to civil war led through Freeport. It's right there on a sign. Because Douglas answered in the affirmative that the people have a right to determine their state constitutions, even over the will of the people in the given states. So I think it was the birth of what you all refer to as states' rights. And when Strom was down there in your parts, and he referred to that group of folks as Dixiecrats. So when you do and Mary's nodding in the affirmative, And so that term Dixiecrats, I mean, that's a special group of folks. So you look at the thread of history. If I was a history professor, on the first day of school, I'd teach what's going on today. Then the second day, I'd start backwards, because everything that's going on today has got a root. And if we keep looking deep enough, we'll find the tap root as to why things are the way they are. And that's what we're living in your day. But it's certainly not unfamiliar to me.
Mr. President, what would you say was your greatest accomplishment as President of the United States?
Well, it's on the record, Donald, and I can't deny it. January the 1st, 1863, Secretary of State William Seward, the guy I defeated for the nomination, same guy, made him Secretary of State. I needed him. And a brilliant jurist and a brilliant Secretary of State. He came to me in the East Room and he said, "Sir, it's ready." And I had already shaken hands with 5,000 visitors on New Year's Day at the Executive Mansion. And I picked up that pen to sign my name. And my hand trembled. It's like when you've been hammering nails for 3 or 4 hours and you set down your hammer and then you go to pick it up and your hand tremors. That's the same thing, fatigue. And I said, I must not hesitate, for if I do, people will look at this signature in the future and say, his heart was not in it. So I rubbed the fatigue out of my hand and I picked up that pen and signed my full name, Abraham Lincoln. And I said, if I'm to be remembered for anything, it will be for signing this. And that document was the Emancipation Proclamation, a War Powers Act, but it was a catalyst for the next step to get us from the House divided speech in 1858 to the 13th Amendment to the United States Constitution, freeing all folks and taking another step to form a more perfect union where we know now that all men and all women are created free and equal.
Thank you very much, Mr. President, for joining us. We appreciate it. Now I want to introduce you. Folks, Mr. President here is actually Mr. George Buss. So, George, thank you for being with us today. George does live in Freeport, Illinois. So, looky there. Switches his glasses, and I understand you do this kind of stuff all over the United States. Am I correct?
This has taken on a life of its own that I never anticipated. But now we had just sent our taxes in. And so in 2019, excluding airfare, we did about 36,000 miles of travel as Lincoln. And when I had to calculate the trips, so there's 26 lines on a paper, it was double column. So of those trips, there were a little more than 52, but that doesn't include, those weren't individual trips. So they were multiple presentations. So we're pushing 100, 110 a year. So it has taken on a life of its own, and it has just been a wonderful blessing. And of course, and then to appear with you all until I can get there live.
Absolutely. Someone wants to know where your hat is.
I keep my hat.
Somebody get a screenshot of this. You just stay right there. We're going to get a screenshot. This will be a good post for Facebook. And then somebody, Terry Egan's got it. Thank you, sir. Or TJ. Sorry, TJ.
And I keep a suitable copy of the Gettysburg Address in my hat, because one thing I would never disappoint is a young person who has read the book, Mr. Lincoln's Hat, in 3rd or 4th grade. And in there, they talk about Lincoln carrying papers in his hat. So there are any number of children who come up to me, and they won't ask me if I have papers in my hat. They will say, "May I see the papers in your hat?" Can you imagine their disappointment if I showed them my hat without papers? I just don't. So I carry those. And then if they ask, I give it to them. And the beard is real. It's just a little different color than usual. And so Mary, there's Mary. I got to be Abe Lincoln because, as Terry asked me earlier today, he said, "How'd you get into this?" I said, "The coat fit." And it does. So I'm at about 170 pounds. And the coat fits. And this being the site of the second Lincoln-Douglas debate, my entire life it was a parking lot until 1988, where we decided that it should be in a park-like setting with interpretation. And now there's a statue of Lincoln and Douglas in debate down there. But in order to draw attention to that, my good friend, the late Rich Sokup, wrote a short script called A Discussion with President Lincoln and Judge Douglas, reminiscing about the debates. So they needed somebody to do Lincoln. And so they said, "How about you?" And I did have back when Terry was in school, one of my students, this was actually naturally black and it looked pretty good. Now I have to give it a little help. But in those days, I was about 150 pounds. So there wasn't a lot of meat on the rack, and 6'5". So they said, you'll make a suitable Lincoln. Well, then we went along here locally until C-SPAN came to town in 1994 and taped 3 hours of the full debates in Freeport. In fact, they did all 7 sites, and I did Lincoln for 2 of them. Richie and I did Lincoln and Douglas in Freeport and Jonesboro. And then this thing took on a life of its own. So I've been in half the states, and I have an invitation to Germany in September, but I don't think we're going to be able to fly. But I've had invitations to 25 states and the White House, Mariners Museum and Newport News, Georgia, Mississippi, Minnesota, the Minnesota History Center. It's just wonderful. Laid a wreath at Lincoln Memorial in February. So I do a lot of work for the Lincoln Group of DC. It's a blessing, just an absolute blessing.
What are your feelings on the recent damage to the Lincoln Memorial?
Well, we've got some elements, and I understand the right to protest, but I think we've got some elements who are saying, in the extreme. And so, there again calls for moderation. So are there some, and the question I answered for the Chicago Sun-Times earlier in the week, they ask about, monuments and memorials. And I said, well, now I said, in the case of Stephen Douglas, they want to take his statue off of his tomb in Chicago, but they don't want to disturb his burial. I said, well, how can you take part of the guy's tomb and not disturb his burial? And that was put up in 1866. But I said that you have to ask yourself 3 questions. Who put it up? When did they put it up? And why did they put it up? And then now you can have a public discourse. My view is public statutes are there to be a catalyst for public discussion. And so we're having that discussion right now on statutes, which is exactly why we should be having it. Now, are they all appropriate? I don't know if I'm the final arbiter of that, but we are having a discussion as to the why and the when and the who. And if there's maliciousness behind that, then that needs to be in the public discussion. And I think that's where we are right now. But to tear something down just to tear it down, you know, that's not appropriate either. That's bordering on anarchy. But petition the government. First Amendment. Have your redress in the public square. And, you know, when you start taking the law into your own hands, you're a step away from anarchy. But the Constitution calls for a redress of your protest in the public square. And we've got to maintain that at any cost.
Well, thanks again for taking a lot of time with us today and sharing your amazing story. Yeah, you are amazing. So thank you.
Appreciate that.
And sharing the history of Abe Lincoln. So we do really, really appreciate it.
Well, I have an invitation to come to Myrtle Beach, and then we're going to go down to Charleston because I have to see your Senate President, McConnell. I've known him for about a decade when they brought the Hunley out of the water. And now he's president of Charleston University. And he gave me an invitation to go there. So Terry says I need to come to Myrtle Beach. We're going to go see Sumter, and we're going to go down to Charleston, and we're going to eat crawdads.
All right, sounds good. For those on this call, thank you for joining us. I want to call your attention to the next 3 speakers, because we do these conversations with Rotary Action people 3 times a week. On Monday, July 20th, we will be joined by Ann Walker with the Alston Wilkes Society. On Wednesday, the 22nd, that's our all-club call at noon. We're going to be joined by Ron Pierce, and he's going to do his Thinking Outside of the Box Strategies for Building Membership. So here's a take-home homework for all of you joining. If you're the membership chair of your club, great. If you're not the membership chair of your club, we want them on that call on Wednesday, July 22nd at noon. They will be getting the emails. Make sure they're there. We'd love to see all the membership chairs across the district and a lot more members on that call. And then next Friday, 11 o'clock, 1 week from today, we're going to be joined by polio survivor, Mr. John Nanny. So great week next week. Hope everyone has a wonderful weekend. To conclude today, I will do the Rotary 4-way test. Of the things we think, say, or do, is it the truth? Is it fair to all concerned? Will it build goodwill and better friendships? Will it be beneficial to all concerned? Have a great Friday and a wonderful weekend. See everyone on Monday for the next conversations with Rotary Action people. That's a wrap. Take care. Goodbye.